Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's event with the University of Utah Alumni Association. My name is Alex Steele. I'm a member of the Salt Lake City Alumni Club Board, and I'll be moderating our presentation today. Our presentation is titled Mindful Self-Compassion, a Practice of Recovery and Resilience, and today's event is sponsored by University of Utah Health Plans. Our speaker today is Trinh Mai, who is a licensed clinical social worker. Trinh, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
Thank you, Alex. So as Alex says, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I work with the Resiliency Center and Wellness and Integrative Health with the University of Utah Health. I've been at the U though for is it 15 years now? So many of those years was as teaching faculty with the College of Social Work.
Trinh, we're excited to have you here, and why don't you go ahead and get started, and I'll ask questions throughout the presentation as they come in. If the audience has questions that they want to ask, please chat them in and we'll try to get all of them answered. So Trinh, the time is yours. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna share before sharing my screen, I think let's do a practice together. A lot of my presentations are actually very experiential because I feel like we learn best when we apply the learning, but it's hard to do that on this kind of platform. And yet I'd like to invite you to engage with this and to experiment with some of these practices as best as you're able. The first one is going to be stop. So I love starting things by stopping. And it's a chance for us to take a step back and connect with what's happening inside, connect with what's important, our intention for this time that we're about to have together. Stopping throughout the day also actually really helps the nervous system to come down closer to baseline. So it's kind of like exhaling, right, as you go, instead of accumulating stress throughout the day, and then 10 p.m. when you're trying to sleep, your head is still full. So we're going to take a moment to stop and just exhale and let some of the stress get digested. This practice is based on an acronym called STOP, which is nice because it's helpful to remember. And S stands for stop, T is take a breath, O is observe openly. And we're going to observe some of our internal advisors, our thoughts, our emotions, and our bodily sensations. We don't have to control them. We don't have to fix them, but we don't have to ignore them either. So think of them as your board of advisors, right? Your job is to listen to them and see what they have to say. And then you make the ultimate final decision. And then P in the stop is proceed with intention. So let's do this. It's just going to be a few minutes. And if you have a different grounding, pausing practice, you can also do that. So sit back. A lot of us tend to lean forward, right? Like full speed ahead, and that's wonderful. But health is about balance. So allow yourself a chance to sit back, feel your feet on the ground. Close your eyes if you feel comfortable, or just lower your gaze. And we'll hit the stop button together. It's probably been a busy morning already with lots of problem solving, meetings, responding to loved ones and to coworkers. So just giving yourself a moment just to be. And then connecting with the fact that you're alive, take a deep breath in. Feel the air enter the nostrils, opening you up. And then exhaling completely. Just being with the exhale for as long as you can. And then take another luxurious breath and feel that breath. observing openly is basically asking yourself, how am I? We do that with many people. We don't tend to do that with ourselves. So taking a moment and asking, how are you? Directing that attention, that care to yourself. How's your body? Maybe noticing the areas that tend to hold tension, like the jaw, the shoulders, the arms, the legs, the stomach. And inviting a release. You don't have to force things, but you can kind of soften and let go if you're holding the muscles unnecessarily. And what parts of your bodies are working well? We tend to ignore those parts. So just acknowledging them for a moment. What parts feel quote unquote normal? And don't worry if you're doing this wrong or right. It's not important. You're just bringing caring attention to yourself. Now bring attention up to the mind, and you might already be up there because we tend to live up there, and that's okay, that's normal. But just stepping out of the traffic of thinking and observe what's passing through. Are they thoughts of plans, remembering, problem solving, or maybe no thoughts right now? And then are there any emotions circulating in the body? Emotions are experienced as energy in the body. So like, for example, anxiety is what I usually experience, and I feel that in the gut. So just noticing if you feel any emotions in your body, and you might not. But if you do, maybe naming it. Like agitated, impatient, relaxed, curious, nervous, grateful. And just take all of it in with a breath, as if you're acknowledging and allowing yourself to be exactly as you are in this moment. Taking yourself in, listening, and then exhaling and letting go. And maybe dropping this question into your body and just seeing if anything emerges. What's important about this time, this presentation for you? What would you like to learn or experience? What's important? And take in anything that is coming up, and maybe nothing is, and that's okay. But practicing asking yourself, what's important? Connecting with our intentions. And then as you're ready, you can open your eyes and just notice how you feel, savoring any goodness from your radical act of stopping. All right. Thanks for that. I actually feel much more grounded and connected now too. So I hope that that you've experienced some of that as well. And if you actually experienced the reverse, where you went in, you're like, oh my gosh, it's a mess in there, right? That's okay. That's data, that's information. And when you have information, then you can respond, right? In a more tailored way, right? Maybe how do I create some space this afternoon? So yeah, so whatever you find in there, it's information for you to use accordingly. Okay, so Alex, can I I'm going to share my screen and share some slides, and feel free to shoot out questions if something could use clarification, or All right, so that's the stop practice we just did. S, stop. T, take a breath. O, observe openly. P, proceed with intention. You do this throughout the day. It helps to metabolize stress as you go. And it helps you to connect with what's important during the day instead of always what's urgent, right? Okay, so resilience. I want to talk a little bit about what resilience is and talk about how self-compassion is a practice that can cultivate resilience or recovery, right? In order to cultivate the quality of resilience. So this is one definition, there are many. But this is by Dr. Ron Epstein. He talks about resilience as being the capacity to respond to stress in a healthy way such that goals are achieved at minimum psychological and physical costs. So, you know, when I read this definition, I think of that we each have a reservoir of energy, of resources, of well-being. And we can deposit into that reservoir, right? We can feed and nourish that reservoir or fill our cup, so to speak. And we can also empty our cup with stress. Now, stress isn't necessarily bad. We need stress to grow, right? Wisdom and learning comes from pain. Unfortunately, that's kind of the reality. But how can we learn in a way that minimizes stressors' impact on us, on our bodies, hearts, and minds, on our communities? So there are, I want to emphasize first that there are systemic, and in fact, those resources are even more impactful. Burnout in healthcare, for example, 80% of burnout is related to systemic factors, right? Workload, workflow. 20% of burnout is related to personal practices of resilience. So I want to say that first, because it's not all about individual responsibility. It's a combination of individual responsibility and systemic community resources, right? The choices that we make in order to cope depend on the choices we have. With that said, what is cool about personal resilience practices is that you can incorporate them and implement them right away. So you can see the results immediately, and it's easy to control, right? So that's what's lovely about knowing what can I control. And so these are 5 personal sources of resilience to help you to cope, to support yourself as we move as a community to impact the community and systemic issues. So some of them are, and I would say these are all related, but especially self-awareness, mindfulness, and compassion. Those 3 are definitely siblings. Mindfulness is really trendy, but the word simply means awareness, right? Awareness of what you're paying attention to, awareness of what you're doing, awareness of who's in front of you. So a sense of presence, right? And then meaning and purpose. As humans, we can endure a lot if we know why. And if it's something that is important to us, right? So connecting to your meaning and purpose. And then self-care. Now, self-care, you know, in our society sometimes means things that you can consume, like a pedicure, a manicure, which is lovely. I love those. A day at the spa, right? A luxurious vacation in the Caribbean. But that's not what I mean here in terms of self-care. Self-care here is that humans need the basics. And yet the basics sometimes is not accessible. The basics meaning eating foods that are food is pleasurable. I'm going to say that eating foods that are pleasurable and nourishing for your body. Sleeping about 5 to 8 hours, prioritizing sleeping for yourself because it impacts cognitive functioning, memory, right, related to that, emotional regulation. It improves our mood, our energy level. It affects everything. And then the other is movement, moving our bodies. In a year where most of us are online, for socializing, for working, for education, right? Movement is so critical to weave in to take care of our bodies, minds, and hearts. And then finally, relationships, right? Relationships are golden in terms of medicine to support our well-being. So maybe just reflect for a moment, which of these have kind of helped you, have supported you this past challenging year?
Trinh, I have a question. Earlier in your presentation, I liked what you said about focus on what's important, not on what's urgent. And that sort of speaks to, meaning and purpose. What advice do you have when, a lot of us in our professional roles have a lot that we have to get done throughout the day that is urgent, but maybe not necessarily what gives us meaning and purpose? How do you advise people to find balance?
Yeah, that's right. Like if I could answer that question, I would be off on that Caribbean vacation. But I think it's Alex, it's even giving voice. It's even asking the question, right? Like allowing the question of what's important to me to even be present. Because usually what is urgent dominates, and we don't even ask that other question. So balancing is a negotiation of two opposites, if you will, right? Kind of like the seesaw. So sometimes it's responding to what's urgent to your boss or your team. But then once you've done that, hey, what's also important to me? So so an ongoing conversation, negotiation. Yeah. Okay. So today we're going to talk about specifically self-compassion, but I want to define compassion. And I like this one, might be too sappy for some of you. But compassion is meeting suffering with love. Another definition of compassion is the desire to reduce suffering. So speaking of suffering, right, there's been a lot of suffering this past year to varying degrees for all of us. I mean, you think about how your life was in January of 2020, right? And how different it has been in the past year and a half. We've made drastic changes to how we work, how we play, how we connect, how we parent. And many of us have had severe losses, traumatic losses, right? Deaths in our families due to COVID or other illnesses. And then many of us have also experienced an increase of assaults from racism, sexism, that's been perhaps supported by, right, well, historical racism and present day racism and sexism, heterosexism, but also because of the increased polarization and a very divisive election, right? Many of us who have oppressed identities have experienced increased microaggressions, macroaggressions, have felt a decrease in sense of safety. And then, who can forget the earthquake? I mean, I had to change my relationship with the ground. I'm a mindfulness teacher, so I often say, feel your feet on the ground. But after she quaked and tremored for several months, I couldn't say, put my feet on the ground anymore, because it was kind of scary. So, so lots of things have been shaken up, literally and metaphorically, this past year for us. And our team at the Resiliency Center, we've been using this phases of disaster reaction to kind of help us to guide and predict how we might be feeling as a community. So, March to May of 2020 was probably in this heroic honeymoon, right? Like lots of energy to make changes, to work, to healthcare, to parenting. People, right? Like sometimes the adrenaline makes us do funny things like hoard toilet paper and canned foods. But we had a lot of energy back in the day. And then we went through this long period of disillusionment when we were just tired and depressed and anxious and wondering, when is it going to be over? And then now we're here, we're on this climb into reconstruction. And some of you, right, are privileged enough, right, in different capacities to be maybe up here. You're already feeling pretty energized and normal. And there's no need to feel guilty for that, right? Like we need people with resources and energy. And you can use those resources and energy and privilege for good. And then there are many of us that are kind of right here. We're working through the grief of last year. We've lost people to COVID. We might have, a lot of people also went through family changes like divorce this past year. We lost friendships. So we're working through this grief, and that's okay too, right? Others are tired. And the idea of thinking, okay, we're actually going to have to make changes to return to to work in the office again causes a lot of anxiety in many of us, right? What? I just got used to this. So we're all over the place with this, and wherever you are, the compassionate practice is to be okay and to allow to feel your feelings and allow your feelings, because there are reasons for them. So just to kind of put your feelings in a larger context, this is from the American Psychological Association. They found that American professionals and Americans reported an increase of average levels of stress since April 2020. That's kind of a no-brainer, huh? And then the Harvard Business Review did a big global study of professionals, and they found that, right, people reported a reduction of work-life balance, of well-being perception, of social connection, and an increase in burnout and job demands. So, yeah, and this makes sense. In addition to your regular job, you were constantly assimilating to changes, right? Making new changes, innovating. And there's a lot of beautiful growth and innovations that have come out of that, but it's exhausting to deal with change continually.
Trin,
yeah.
But I guess I assume you'll talk about this, but it feels like the right time to bring it up. In that chart where you were talking about, the heroic and honeymoon phase and dealing with grief, it's interesting to hear you talk about 2020, because that's like a shared global experience that everybody has, that you know what people went through, they know what you went through. It's like this shared human experience at this moment in time. But so many of these things that happen are so big on such a large scale, and talking about people having to deal with issues of racism and sexism and micro and macro aggressions and politics, and it can feel very overwhelming and sort of stressful. If you're going to talk about it later, that's great. If you could talk a little bit about it now, how can people just sort of cope with everything that happens all the time on this massive scale where it makes people feel so helpless.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully hopefully I'll speak to that. And if I don't, Alex, at the end, just hold me accountable and ask that question again, right? But I think first is recognize that we've been through a lot. And I'm gonna talk about the 3 phases of reconstruction that that I'm proud to say I'm a part of formulating with the Resiliency Center at UView Health. And the first phase of reconstruction is recognizing how we are right now as individuals and as a team. And that requires checking in and asking, how are you really, right? Beyond the, I'm fine, thank you, let's get to work. But, yes, you're fine, and what? And what? And then recognizing the losses and the growth. So investing some time in reflecting with you and your people on how are you currently, what's been lost, and what have you accomplished this past year? We've accomplished a lot as humans. And speaking directly to your question, Alex, it gives me a lot of strength to remember, well, to one, acknowledge what I and my communities have been through, and we're still here. And also to reflect on the ancestors, the people that came before us and what they have endured and overcome and have fought for us. And that gives me a lot of strength. And that gives me the reminder that as humans and as life, as living beings on Earth, we're resilient. We bounce back. So recognizing what's happening, and that includes if you're in crisis right now, if you're hurting, right? Because once you know where you are, you can make a plan to care for yourself and to head towards recovery. So the next stage would be to recover. And a lot of us in our culture tends to move fast, right? Big emphasis on productivity. And so we might skip this stage of recovery, but it's important to take the time to recover and rest and replenish, restore, any of the re's that is your favorite word, to, again, right, refill the cup. And this is what helps us to grow from trauma rather than to continue suffering. So there's a like PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress, but there's also post-traumatic growth, post-traumatic resilience. And that comes from taking the time to invest in responding to how we're feeling and caring for ourselves. And then the last stage is rebuild. Don't let the suffering be for nothing, right? How can we take the lessons from people who have had to die, literally, from all the losses that we've experienced? How can we take those lessons and invest them in a more sustainable and a more healthy future? And I would argue that self-compassion is a big part of that. So self-compassion, maybe just close your eyes for a moment. We just kind of went big. We situated ourselves into a global context and reflected on this past year and kind of named some of the hard things that we experienced. So just take a moment and sit back and maybe close your eyes, take a breath. And you can name any feelings that you might have inside, or just acknowledge the energy with like a nod if you know you want something concrete, kind of like I see you. And then open your eyes, reconnect with the colors in your room, feel your feet on the ground. And then I'm going to invite you to reflect on self-compassion. What does that mean to you, that word? When I say self-compassion, what comes up? And Alex, since you're here with me, I'm going to ask you, what does self-compassion bring up for you? What words?
For me, it's sort of like a kindness to yourself. I think if we're compassionate to others, we're patient, we're kind, we try to be understanding, we try to, you know, meet the other person where they are and help them along however we can. And so self-compassion would be those sorts of same qualities, but to yourself. So being kind to yourself, being patient with yourself, you know, giving yourself the benefit of the doubt. Those sorts of things is what comes to my mind.
Yes, yes. Alex should be teaching this. Yeah, right. Like I love the practices you named, Alex. Acknowledging and allowing people to be where they are, and offering care and support, right? Patience. Patience is huge, because we always want to be where we're not, right? We want to be we want to have mastered everything that we've cared about. But a lot of times when people think of self-compassion, they don't think of being a friend to yourself, which is kind of what Alex described. They think of it as, you know, self-pity, or it means weak, like you're kind of being soft on yourself, and you're just gonna, you know, not achieve your goals. Or they might think it's narcissistic and egotistical or selfish, right? I know a lot of people of color, including myself, feel like, you know, I don't have time to think about myself. There's a lot of needs in our community that we need to continue fighting for. But guess what? We're a part of the community. So caring for ourselves is caring for our communities. Research shows, and you can check it out on selfcompassion.org. There's a lot of research that shows that the practice of self-compassion reduces stress, anxiety, depression, shame. In some ways, self-compassion is the antidote or the opposite of shame, that it's okay to make mistakes, that you're human, and humans are evolving and growing and learning. And so, of course, humans are going to make mistakes. And it leads to more resilience from stressors, from more physical to more physical health and well-being, because you're caring for yourself, right? Being a friend to yourself is also encouraging you to care for yourself. You know, do that exercise, take that swimming lesson that you've always wanted to take. So lots of positive outcomes from the practice of self-compassion.
Trin, what would you say if somebody said, I don't know how to do self-compassion, or what if I'm doing it wrong? What would you say?
Yeah. So, you know, there's lots of ways to practice being a friend to yourself, right? Because there's lots of ways of being a friend. But I'm going to share one model, just for you to kind of start with some ingredients. Here's a basic recipe, and then you can kind of, you know, play with the recipe and tailor it to what you would like. So this self-compassion model has been developed by Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer. And they brought together spiritual practices of Buddhism, as well as other Asian spiritual traditions. And, you know, this is a good time to kind of think about what are some of the spiritual traditions or religious traditions or cultural traditions that have taught you about compassion? What does compassion look like in your world, right? And kind of think about that. I think is a question worth exploring. But with this model, there are three main ingredients to self-compassion. One is mindfulness. And mindfulness, this is one definition when you're suffering, is recognizing, there's that word again, recognizing when we're stressed or struggling without being judgmental, minimizing, or overreacting. So feel your feelings, allow yourself to feel inadequate, painful. Allow yourself to feel helpless, powerless, because that's part of the human spectrum of emotion. We're not always going to be on top, right? So we shouldn't always be on top. Then the second ingredient is, I'm going to jump to connectedness, is that shared humanity, which is, right, has the same beginning as humility. Staying close to the ground, right? Remembering that everyone makes mistakes, everyone experiences difficulties at times. And this is hard because when we are suffering, we feel alone. We feel like it's only happening to us, but we're not alone. In fact, suffering connects us to other humans, because that's one of the experiences we share. And then responding, once we recognize, once we allow, right, our humanity, can we respond with caring gestures? And sometimes the caring is offering words of support, saying to yourself what you would say to a good friend. Other times it's a warm touch, and other times is, tough love, right? Like, come on now, you got to get off that couch and you got to get back out there, right? So that's also kindness. Now, I want to name some of the barriers to doing this. Some of the barriers to being kind to yourself is our own stress reaction. When we're stressed, right, the hormones in our body kick us into a mode that is considered, that's called fight, flight, or freeze. Our heart beats faster, there's more blood pumped to the muscles. We get tense, right, because we're preparing for fight, flight, and freeze. And often we turn that fight, flight, and freeze inward to ourselves, because it's easier to fight ourselves than probably anyone else. Right? Like if you've just had a horrible experience with your colleague, you might have said something to your colleague, right? But you're probably going to critique yourself for that interaction for the next, I don't know, however many hours. You're going to critique yourself for getting into that situation in the first place. You're going to say things like, you should have known better, you should have practiced, or you should have prepared. Or you might isolate, right, which is flight. Another way to flight is to numb it out with food, substances, work. And then freeze is when we ruminate. We just kind of replay that broken record. We kind of replay the 5-minute interaction for the whole weekend. And these are also normal, and there's nothing wrong with you. It's part of the stress reaction, especially when you're not conscious. But when you catch yourself ruminating, right, then you have a choice. You can choose to do something that will help loosen the freeze, like movement. Movement is the opposite of freezing, and that helps to maybe release some of that anxious energy, those stress hormones. Mindfulness is also an antidote. Having awareness that you're freezing, naming the emotion that's causing the rumination is a release. Remembering a common humanity and responding caringly are all antidotes to the stress reaction. So I'm gonna just kind of show you how that stress reaction looks. So you might start with hurt, right? You're kind of hurt, just ambiguous hurt. And then anything that's negative, usually the next thought is, I don't want to feel this. How dare she? Or I want to make this stop. And then more anger and grief comes. And then you react out of anger. So you yell maybe at others or at yourself. And then you feel bad. So then there's guilt and rumination. So maybe the original stressor was a hurt, but then we layered on like an onion with our reactions. And so if we can catch ourselves at any of this reaction, we can minimize and reduce the harm, right, of the stressor, and we can recover easier. So how do we do this? I'm gonna actually skip to this and talk about two things. So the mindfulness is recognize and allow how you're feeling, right? And then the connectedness, I find these statements, if you like mantras, you can call them mantras. But having some statements, some reminders to yourself that you're human is helpful. I like to remember that we're works in progress, that no one's perfect, so why should I expect myself to be perfect? That stress and suffering is part of everyone's life, that we grow from it. And the other question that I like to remember to ask is, are my expectations and standards realistic and fair? That's where a lot of the self-criticism comes from. It's like, oh, wow, I've just, had to recreate my job this past year, but somehow I'm expecting myself to, to just be on top of my game every day. So are my expectations and standards and realistic and fair? So if you don't want to be kind to yourself, can you be fair to yourself? Can you practice self-justice? And then self-kindness, these are some ideas, right? Just to kind of generate for you. We don't need much. We actually don't need to, to do a lot to help ourselves feel better, which is the amazingness of our human body. Physically, if we take deep breaths, that calms the nervous system. A soothing touch, like, when you see a kid fall, right? You pick them up and you kind of like soothe them, you rub their backs, where's the hurt? You rub their, the pain. And that actually works for us too. We can put a hand on where it hurts. So some of you might be like, oh, that's kind of touchy-feely, you don't know. And I'll tell you why you do that. Because science has shown that the soothing touch actually reduces production of cortisol in the body, which is the stress hormone, and it increases oxytocin, which is the hormone that promotes the feeling of love and warmth and connection. And that also soothes pain and suffering. And of course, walk, move. Emotions are energy, right? And if we can kind of channel that energy into movement, then that helps to kind of release that energy. Emotions can be cared for with words of understanding, support, connect with a friend. If you can't give yourself those words of support, connect with a friend, they can give it to you. And then if you're more of a cognitive person, reappraise the situation. Am I okay right now? If I were to ask you, right, like, are you okay right now? I would bet that most of you would say yes. Right now, you're okay. And then asking yourself questions like, what is needed right now? What is needed later? What can I learn from this? Those are questions that connect you with the meaning and purpose. What can I learn from this? How can I channel this towards how can I pay it forward? How can I pay this lesson forward? All right. So I'm going to leave you with an acronym to practice with on your own. And you can do this as a journal reflection, or you can do this as a kind of a stop practice like we did at the beginning, but more targeted towards hard emotions. So rain, the R in, and we could, let's just do this briefly as a meditation. Just kind of sit back, take a breath, feel that release with the exhale and allow the complete release. And then the R in rain is recognize. So recognize anything that's hard in your body right now. For me, it's some tension in my back and a little pressure in my head to say, hey, time's up. So just recognizing what's kind of hard in your body, if anything. If there's nothing, recognize the goodness, enjoy that. And then A in the rain is allow what you're experiencing. Allow yourself to feel what you're feeling. You might take in a breath just to take it in. And then I is investigate in the body. So feel your feelings. Just feel it a little bit. And if it's too much, you don't have to spend that much time with it. You can just spend small, short periods of time just to get to know it a little and then come back to it later. But when you feel, you heal. So feel what's there. And then N is nurture. So ask yourself, what is needed? What's needed now? Can you offer yourself some words of support? Or maybe a hand to the part that hurts? Or a deep breath, taking it in with a breath and releasing what can be released right now. And then opening the eyes as you're ready. Just noticing if there's any shifts from your practice. Thank you for experimenting if you did. And I am going to leave you this slide of resources if you're interested in learning more about self-compassion or mindfulness. I offer some courses on this link here. And then we actually have a YouTube channel with wellness and integrative health that includes mindfulness. We actually did a whole series for Sundance Festival. So it's called Be Well Utah. And the imagery is beautiful. So I highly recommend that. And if you work for the U, there's Employee Wellness Resources, has a variety of different resources that is worth checking out. I've also included some articles locally and a website nationally if you want to learn more about self-compassion. Okay, and then I'm going to leave you with this quote. Vulnerability is the core of shame and fear in our struggle for worthiness. But it appears that it's also the birthplace of joy, of creativity, of belonging, of love.
Thank you, Trinh.
Yeah.
And I believe that these resources will be shared with people who have signed up for this event. So you can expect to see these resources come through to your email. Trinh, for people who might be sort of new to this world and new to mindfulness, what would be your advice to sort of get them engaged, to get them to make this a more regular practice in their own lives?
Yeah, it's, I think when we first try something, it's helpful to have support. So, a class is helpful to have that community support and structure. An app is also helpful. There's a variety of apps right now, right, that you can use. You can check out one of the videos on our Wellness and Integrative Health YouTube channel and see how you feel about that. So if this is something that's piquing your curiosity, feed it, try it out.
That's great advice. And yeah, I think for some people, they might be interested, but maybe nervous to try it out, or feeling a little different from how they felt before. So I think that's great advice. All right, thanks, Trin. I had a great time, and I actually was taking notes during this. I learned a lot myself, and I hope that people who are watching were able to learn from it as well, and to take something away from this that they can apply into their lives. Thank you, Trin, for being here. And thank you again to University of Utah Health Plans for sponsoring today's event. If you have questions, reach out to the Alumni Association. Thank you for being with us today. Take care, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.